Welcome everyone to the broadcast studio at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. And hope when you come through Chicago, you'll come and stop and see us. We're just on the near north side of northwest side, I should say, of Chicago. Um, we're happy to have Richard here, Richard Kreitner, who has written for the New York Times, The Nation, Slate, Raritan, The Baffler, and Jewish Currents, among others. He's a writer of columns, mainly on, he just told me, on the Hudson Valley, and a contract editor for journals like The Nation. Uh, he's the author of Break It Up, Secession, Division, and the Secret History of America's Imperfect Union. Also booked A Traveler's Guide to Literary Locations Around the World. The second or fifth edition should have us in there, of course. His latest book is Fear No Pharaoh, American Jews, and oh, you have there it is. Fear No Pharaoh, American Jews, the Civil War, and the Fight to End Slavery. It's a Farrar Straus publication, 401 pages illustrated, and is $32. So also you're going to have this signed bookplate as Bjorn showed you. Next time, hopefully, we'll have Richard or other authors back live here in our studio. But the pandemic kind of disrupted those plans. So tell us, Richard, let's get started with the book a bit. We'll talk about the characters that populate the book, and there are six especially that come to mind, but there are many others. But what about the Pharaoh? How did you get Fear No Pharaoh? Was there only one Pharaoh, more pharaohs? How did that come about?
How did the title of the book come about?
Please.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Daniel, for having me. Thank you, Bjorn, for setting it up and administrating the talk here. I'm really excited to be here virtually with the bookstore. So how did the title come about? Well, it's interesting. First, I had a different title, which will kind of involve us getting into a fellow named August Bondy, who's one of the six major characters that I'm dealing with in the book. And I open and end the book with him. We could talk about him later. He was born in Vienna. He fought in the Viennese Revolution, and then later with John Brown in Bleeding, Kansas. And there's long been a story told, including in some major works of history, Simon Schama's The Story of the Jews, and many other places, and you'll find it online, that on January 1st, 1863, Bondy, this Jewish immigrant from Vienna, camped out with the Union Army in Arkansas, wrote in his journal to celebrate the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation that he wrote in his journal, "No more pharaohs and no more slaves," which would be kind of a perfect encapsulation of the anti-slavery politics that I think many of us wish that most Jews had at the time of the Civil War, because it's the appealing, stance to take, at least in hindsight. And I thought that would make a great title for my book. When I actually dug into that story, despite its repetition online and in history books, it ends up not being the case. He wrote something far more prosaic in his journal. He just wrote, "No more slaves return to their masters," which is not poetic, it's not lyrical, and it doesn't encapsulate anything. So then we had to go and look for another title. This one comes from something that another of my characters, another anti-slavery character, about three of my characters are anti-slavery, and the rest are a little more complicated. And this comes from something that a anti-slavery rabbi named David Einhorn said when he came to America in 1855, and he gave his first sermon arriving in Baltimore. And he said, he's talking about how lucky Jews were to find a refuge in the United States. "We fear no Pharaoh on this sacred soil of liberty," basically. Gotcha. Saying that we've been oppressed elsewhere, here we are free. But he's also going to end up critiquing slavery.
Now, let me ask you about the makeup of America as far as the Jews are concerned. What was their makeup in the Civil War era? Where had they come from? Where did they enter? Of course, on the East Coast, also in Houston. I suppose that's where many of the Southern Jews stayed in that area. Where did they generally live, and what was their distribution? So that could take us an hour right there. So maybe just give us a quick elevator idea of what the makeup was.
Sure, I'll keep it brief. The population of American Jews in 1850 which is about when my book begins, was about 50,000. And by the time the war begins in 1861, the population is about 150,000. and something like 4 out of 5 of those people are in the north, and 1 out of 5 are in the south. Now, mostly and increasingly, they're coming from the German lands of Central Europe, Germany, Austria, to some extent Hungary, and a smattering of Poland, although that's going, the immigration where my ancestors came from in Ukraine and Poland and Russia is going to come later in the century. The earliest wave of American Jews were arriving from Spain and Portugal and places in the Caribbean, and those were Sephardic Jews. But in this period is when the first massive wave of Jewish immigration is coming to America, and they're largely coming from Germany. And they're settling in eastern cities like New York, Philadelphia, not so much Boston. And in the South, it's not really Houston, it's Charleston, and increasingly New Orleans is a very dynamic Jewish population as well.
Didn't Houston have a fairly uh, large number of immigrants anyway, and Jews part of that? I thought that a great deal came through there.
Not that I know of in the mid
Oh,
19th century. A little bit Galveston, which is a very interesting story.
okay. So what was their general political affiliation? We'll get to one or two of them that were certainly part of the 1848 revolutions in Europe, but what was generally their political affiliations in party, or did the regions themselves influence those parties?
Right. Well, as you and many of your listeners know, much of the political story of the run up to the Civil War is the kind of gradual dying out of partisan divisions between Democrats and Whigs, and the increasing emphasis on sectional loyalties in the North and the South. For the most part, Jews were Democrats. They were in the Democratic Party. They saw themselves as in the tradition of Jefferson, who was obviously for religious liberty, and Jews saw a great importance in that, and also in Jackson for representing kind of the common man. They didn't really see themselves in the Whig Party, which represented more elite establishment tastes, and
Like
generally
Lincoln.
you like Lincoln, but Lincoln was a fairly good Whig. He wasn't a Boston Whig.
No.
But Democrats were also the party of pro immigrants, right? Where Whigs were often flirting at least with a certain nativism, increasingly so in the 1850s. So Jews saw themselves as part of this, democratic movement for the common man, for in a pro-immigrant stance, and for that reason, that often led them to kind of be partisan bedmates, so to speak, with people who were pro-slavery, which was more often in the Democratic Party.
So when the Democrats and the Whigs were breaking up in the mid 50s, uh, did did a percentage of them break off and go to the Republican side because of their anti-slavery views versus the Democrats, even though they were more on the immigrant side?
Yeah, certainly some did, and there were prominent Jews in the Republican Party. Abram Dittenhofer sat behind Lincoln, who's here on the screen with us, when he gave his Cooper Union address in early 1860. There were other Jewish delegates at the 1860 Republican National Convention, including Louis Dembitz, Louis Brandeis's uncle and namesake. So there were prominent Jews, and there was some movement to the Republican Party, especially as you just mentioned this generation of 1848 revolutionaries who fled Europe after the collapse of those revolutionary struggles, like August Bondy, who I mentioned. And those people came to the United States with certain political ideals and philosophical ideas about liberty. And when they were looking around for, a way to kind of channel those energies that had been frustrated in Europe, they landed on the anti-slavery struggle. So that changed the kind of political disposition of some Jewish communities and perhaps the American Jewish community, such as it was overall. But still, going into 1860, and I think even 1864, most Jews are Democrats and are
Hmm.
not supporting Lincoln.
And they stay with the Democrats up and through almost today. Things are changing a bit, but nonetheless, even though the Democratic Party changed, so did the Jews, I think, if we're going to talk about today's as well, which we're not going to really get into very much. There, you have six primary characters, except for Judah Benjamin, who's mainly known to our audience here. They're somewhat unknown, Ernestine Rose and August Bondy, and then there are three influential rabbis that are in this book, and you center it around those six figures, especially, although many other characters are in there in passing who are fascinating to know about. And we'll get to those characters in particular. But how did you choose those primary characters from all those that were out there? Is a commonality to it? Was there particular divide between the secular and religious Jews that brought you to these particular ones? How did you choose?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. There's two spectrums basically that the characters lie along, and those are not necessarily the same. And one is a political spectrum from abolitionist to slave owner and slavery defender, and then a religious spectrum from a kind of hardcore atheist position like Ernestine Rose, who you mentioned, to an Orthodox rabbi, Morris Jacob Rafal, who's in the book. And I was very interested in charting American Jewish responses to the political struggle over slavery and the crisis of the Union and eventually the war itself along both of those spectrums. So how did atheist, Jews who were not religiously Jewish and maybe not even publicly Jewish, but still that was their background. And that was often how they were seen by others and especially opponents. And that's true of Judah Benjamin, who's a political conservative, and also of Ernestine Rose, who's a political radical, that they were both kind of unaffiliated with organized Judaism, but still were seen as Jews, and I think in many cases were deeply Jewish. And so, but the project began as a study of Jewish abolitionists that I undertook many, many years ago when I was in college. And it just always interested me, to what extent did those Jews who spoke out against slavery do so on the basis of their Jewish tradition and Exodus and the Passover story? And then as I started to think of this as a real book, I wanted to kind of widen the lens to think about not only those people who I agreed with and whose positions I admired, but even those on the kind of other end of the spectrum who were either pro-slavery or just wanted, which was a very popular position, Jews to just stay quiet about it. So then I started trying to fill in kind of all the places along that spectrum, both of those spectrums, and try to get these people kind of in conversation with one another, because they were not often in the same room together, which was a kind of structural problem that I had to figure out with the book, how to interweave these stories when they weren't necessarily even known to each other. But they're responding to the same phenomena. They're responding to the same events, Harper's Ferry, Lincoln's election, Appomattox, and they're dealing with many of the same struggles. So by doing it, I hope kind of nimbly, I could kind of make the story work.
Hmm. There's a word that comes out over and over, and your publisher's marketing memo uh, gets into that word, that while you're examining Jews, their thought of slavery in the Civil War and what slavery was to their faith and identity, this is what your publisher is saying too, that you delve into, quote, into the intersection of religion, race, national identity, and politics. Your publisher, all the reviews, your dust jacket blurbs, all use that word intersection. Now, is there perhaps, did you find some singularity in that intersection, to use that word? Something that drew all of them together in some area?
What a very rich question. I'd really not kind of given that particular word much thought, or its contemporary resonance, I suppose, in our discourse today, intersection or intersectionality or something. I think what I found all these figures had in common, and what I really wanted to write a study of basically, is that the Civil War was for them a Jewish experience, right? They experienced it Jewishly, precisely because of who they were. I mean, one kind of outcome or one takeaway of the book is that Jews were not that different from other Americans in many respects. They fought for the Union, they fought for the Confederacy. They owned slaves, they denounced slavery, right? So they were Americans just like everybody else, which is, I think, itself an intervention, because a lot of people think that American Jewish history begins in 1880 with as I say, the massive wave of East European immigration, and they don't realize that Jews were here during the Civil War, Jews were here during the Revolution, and we're kind of left out, and I think even when convenient, kind of excuse ourselves from more controversial discussions about the founding period and the early Republic and the antebellum period and the Civil War. So I think it's something to say and show simply Jews were there, and they participated in all these struggles. The other step of it, as I say, is that they participated as Jews. Certainly these rabbis did, but I think even the more secular characters did as well. August Bondy, the Viennese revolutionary, explicitly did. He said he joined the Union Army because his mother told him and taught him that as a Jew, he had to fight for a system of government that gave equal rights to all beliefs. So they were participating in these debates and then in the war itself and in the aftermath as Jews. And that to me is rich and interesting, and I think that's basically the intersection at which I set up my tent.
Interesting. And of course, Ernestine Rose, of all people, found a Jewish identity to some extent. We'll get to her a little later on. It's interesting here at the in the ending of what I was going to say, and I'll bring it up right now because you did. Might we now conclude that Jews are human beings and that they reflect all aspects of political and social events? And that's what I found in here. Yeah, they were like everyone else in that regard. But the interesting thing also, I guess this is an aside, that the rest of society is not going to let any Jew forget he's Jewish, even if you want to. So I think that's also part of what happened, maybe even with Rose, not to mention Bondi. I want to keep going into your book. I just want to ask you this question because most of our collectors who have books on the subject know of Bertram Korn's book, what, decades ago, American Jewry in the Civil War. How does your book differ from that classic and build on it?
Yeah, it's a great book, and I think, Korn himself did subsequent research, especially on Jews and slavery before the Civil War, after that book came out. So, I think it has demanded updating and reexamination for many years, and I'm certainly not the only person to do it. Adam Mendelsohn, I don't know if you've had him on the show, wrote a wonderful book about Jewish soldiers in the Union Army, and he's digging into and complicating many of Korn's findings. I mean, in many ways, for one thing, Korn has a fairly narrow definition of who counts as Jewish. So Ernestine Rose is not really in his book because she was an atheist. The American Jewish community, for the longest time, did not know what to do with her. She's this hardcore atheist. She marries a Gentile, two actually. And more recent findings suggest that she actually converted in Germany to Christianity for opportunistic reasons, but nonetheless. So because she's been always opposed to not only Judaism, but all organized religion in a kind of new atheist kind of way, she hosted infidel conventions throughout the 1840s, Thomas Paine birthday celebrations. She was a very public atheist. The Jewish community has not quite known what to do with her, and Korn leaves her out of the story. He doesn't see her as Jewish, and I think that's a mistake. I think she lived her life, and certainly the Civil War period and the debate over slavery, as a Jew. She was raised by a rabbi in Poland, her father, and she's deeply Jewish. Bondi also doesn't get a lot of mention there. The rabbis, that controversy is in there, but I also Korn was a wonderful historian, but as a narrative, it's not a piece of narrative history. And I think that the story of these people wrestling with these common questions and landing in such different places, and all those places I find to be very recognizable today in a certain way. I thought, it's time for a new approach, new treatment.
Well, as Ralph Newman, who began my shop, always told me, even though he was not a practicing Jew at all, but the stomach never forgets. And so the food he remembers. And I think Rose and Bondi are products of what the Jesuits say. Give us the child, we have the adult. And
Hmm.
so I think that they get that assimilation from their childhood, and that does not go away. Um, First thing I was thinking of really is if I was at a Seder in the South during the war, or even before, do they have blinders on? Do they turn on their own society later? I mean, what was that like? How could they be at a Seder and own slaves or be in the slave trade even?
That is also a great question, and really one of my kind of animating and motivating questions in looking at this. After many years of sitting at the Seder and thinking about this question, and I read about this in the book, I would bring documents, of a Confederate soldier writing about Passover from the front. Like, what was he thinking? And yeah, we don't know. We don't know. No Confederate Southerner left any records whatsoever
Oh,
of of a moral dilemma or crisis that they faced in those moments. I honestly, I think it almost seems like a cop out, but I kind of think it didn't occur to them. We're so trained, especially American Jews today, to see this as contradictory or as hypocritical, but that's because American Judaism especially has become so imbued with, I think, a interpretation of the Exodus tradition that is a universalist
Hmm.
interpretation, which is that slavery is wrong and should be opposed. And you can trace that through the civil rights movement, and American Judaism has kind of reabsorbed that interpretation of its own tradition in a way that makes us see that as hypocritical. But at the time, I don't believe that they would have. In fact, what's interesting to me and what I found when I write about is that the only people at that Confederate Southern, or even before the Civil War, Southern Seder, who are thinking at all something along the lines of Exodus is alive and well in our own times are the enslaved people, right? That's the part of the Bible that they are grabbing onto and seeing themselves in, and they're saying Jubilee is coming, right? It's not the Southern Jews who are thinking that.
Well, this brings me to something I was going to ask later on, but uh, the subject of Jews being able to speak out. You write that the Jews in the North could more freely speak in support of slavery than the Jews in the South could speak against it. So maybe there's a good story there. I mean, there's a good story you have in the book of the northern man, Lewis Stix, who encountered an unknown Southern Jew in a boarding house. And I think that encapsulates part of that as well.
Right. Well, they get into this kind of armed standoff. Styx, I believe, is not armed, but somebody who he is with is, about whether you can criticize the South and Southern slavery. And the other man, the Southern man, is Jewish. And Styx tells him, how can you defend slavery when you yourself were a slave in Europe?
Mm.
One thing I'm interested in is all these parallels that people are drawing, not just abolitionists, but all these parallels between what's happening in the United States in the middle of the 19th century and who is oppressed and who is enslaved, and other moments in Jewish history where Jews themselves suffered oppression or slavery, even as a metaphorical fact. Now, in general, Jews, we were saying, were just regular Americans and went with their section. So most Jews in the North were pro-union, certainly once the war began, and critical of slavery only to the extent that most Northern whites were critical of slavery, which is at first not much, and then a little bit more so as the 1850s goes on, and Dred Scott and all of that. In the South, most Jews went with the Confederacy and were supportive of slavery. I really try to show the exceptions to that rule. So in the North, there are plenty of Jews who are pro-slavery and anti-war, anti-Lincoln. Isaac Mayer Wise, one of the rabbis who I feature in the book, has this kind of quietist position, which is that Jews should stay out of this controversy and not draw any kind of ire or attention on themselves. And also that Lincoln is probably wrong and that slavery is okay. And there's a section in the book as well about anti-slavery Jews in the South and what ends up, happening to them.
You brought up the abolitionists before, and as I quickly mentioned then, that they were not especially friendly to the Jews. For instance, William Lloyd Garrison. I was unaware of that until your book. He's a good example of that. Was that due to their deeply Christian character of most abolitionists, or how you got into that? You started all this with studying abolitionist Jews. So how do they get along in there?
Yeah, I think it was largely because of the Christian character of abolitionism, which was true both on a personal level of somebody like Garrison, who was really fired up with his own rather idiosyncratic, view of religion, but also on an organizational level. A lot of the juice behind these organizations, the American Anti-Slavery Society, the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, was a Christian organized religious, movement that Jews did not feel very comfortable with. There's a historian, one of the people who's written about this stuff before, Maxwell Whiteman, who has this great line that I quote in the book, that oftentimes a preacher would invoke the prophets or the Old Testament in a sermon only to then turn around and criticize modern day Jews. So there was this dichotomy between Jews as a kind of biblical incarnation of backwardness and even evil, which was true for Garrison, in many cases they admired them as the prophets, and modern Jews who they wanted nothing to do with really. So that was a big part of it. And American Jews, were turned off by this kind of rhetoric and really wanted nothing to do
Mm.
with abolitionism.
You also write that the Christian whites of the South needed Jews as fellow whites to counter the areas where they were predominantly populated by slaves and blacks. Would you comment on that, please?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this gets to the very kind of rich and highly contested question of Jews and race, which if you start your American Jewish story in 1880, there's a certain story you're going to tell about whiteness. Whiteness is something that Jews did not have, and then they eventually have. But if you reel it back, as my book does, to 1848 or even a little earlier than that, it's a much more complicated and interesting question because when slavery existed in America, and especially in the South, Jews were really seen and counted as white. Not in all cases. There are certainly instances that you can cite where that was not the case, where somebody talks about Jews and whites as two separate categories. But for the most part, Jewish immigrants arrived in America. First of all, they were legally white. They were naturalized as citizens under the naturalization law of 1790, which meant that they were taken legally as white. And even socially, especially in the South, and there's a lot of primary sources that document this, that they were seen and welcomed as white, even, suspected still as religious others. But in America at that time, race and racial difference mattered a lot more than religious differences. And so Jews were counted as this, kind of this in-group. That ends up getting complicated in a certain way when slavery gets abolished and, the traditional lines of racial demarcation are blurred in the South. That's when Jews start to kind of lose this racial status. But for the most part, especially in the South, I believe that the South, before the Civil War, was a more congenial place for Jews to be than the North was.
I was just going to ask about that because you that's what you're saying, that they largely felt at home in the Confederacy. They were able, Lee allowed them to observe holidays, Jewish holidays during the war. There were Jewish chaplains before the North had them in the South. So I was going to ask if even, but still there were casual insults. Judah Benjamin and others heard that, I guess, most of the time. So did that vary as well? How the acceptance of Jews in the South, was it different in South Carolina with Charleston there versus Montgomery, Alabama, or middle of Georgia?
Yeah, I mean, anti-Jewish sentiment was there. It was in the South, and it got worse as the war went on. As the war went badly for the South, and there were basic necessities that were missing, people looked around for a scapegoat, and they found it in Judah Benjamin. Jefferson Davis's right-hand man, the power behind the throne, was a very convenient scapegoat for Confederate failures in diplomacy, on the battlefield when he was Secretary of War, and even, what they saw as predatory Jewish merchants and peddlers in the South. So as the war went on, anti-Semitism, though it was not called that yet, got worse in the South. Meanwhile, it was bad in the North all along. Jewish chaplains were banned from the Union Army. They were not in the Southern Army. Ulysses S. Grant issues this famous Order Number 11, kicking all Jews as a class out from his military district in Mississippi. Nothing of that kind had been promulgated in the Confederacy. So it's really only when the war turns south, so to speak, for the Confederacy that the position of Jews in the Confederacy gets quite a bit worse. But it's an interesting problem that anti-Semitism begins to rise in both parts of the country during the war. And I show the characters all dealing with that fallout in different ways.
Yes, oh yes, positively. You see the changes the book goes on. Um, Jews as soldiers, they were in both armies. Um, what percentage of Jews on either side, perhaps, of military age enter the armies? And what percentage might have sat out the war as well? Do the soldiers, their letters, did they mention meeting Jews or maybe changing their minds about them? They certainly did about the blacks when they freed them and brought them into the ranks. They said, "Oh, they're better soldiers than we thought they would be." Did they ever say that about the Jews? What was the Jewish soldier like?
Yeah, sure. There are about 6,000 Jewish soldiers in the Union Army and about 2 to 3,000 in the Confederate Army. Now, my understanding, and this is, Adam Mendelsohn has really crunched the numbers on this, is that was a lower percentage than other immigrants, than other German immigrants, Irish immigrants at the time. And there's been a lot of debate ever since the 19th century over what that means. There have been people going back and forth about whether Jews kind of shirked their duties, which was one of those kinds of anti-Semitic canards that circulated during the Civil War. So they're Jews in both armies. They do encounter one another. It's very interesting. August Bondy leaves this memoir of his service, both with John Brown and then before the war, and then with the Union Army. And he's constantly running into Southern Jews and being welcomed to their homes for Passover. So it's a very interesting thing in that regard. The life of the Jewish soldier. Oh, there he is. Yes, August Bondy. The life of the Jewish soldier is pretty much the same as that of another soldier. There were not really all Jewish regiments the way there were for other ethnicities. There might be larger clusters because they lived together in certain towns and signed up together, and that was true in the North. I believe a Syracuse unit was disproportionately Jewish, and also in Georgia in the Southern Army. But for the most part, they were really scattered across the armies. A lot of Jews found service as commissaries because many of them before the war were merchants, basically traders, peddlers, aspiring merchants, and they knew how to move things around, right? How to kind of make connections across space and time, and how to kind of gather supplies. So they made for good commissaries. Many of them did in both the Union and in the Confederate armies.
Now, Jews as slavers. Interesting. When you got into that, they were certainly singled out, as you say, for the ills of society, and same with the slave trade. There were a number of Jewish slave traders, but maybe not as many as society liked to say there were. What percentage do you think of the Jews were slavers, and how influential may they have been?
A minuscule portion would be the answer to what percentage. It would depend on what time and place. I mean, basically here, this became a big controversy in the 1990s when the Nation of Islam's so-called research department put out a book called The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, which basically suggested that Jews were almost exclusively responsible for the transatlantic slave trade in Africans. And that's just absolutely not true. It's been debunked by, legitimate historians time and time again. So I'm at great pains in this section of the book, kind of early on, to say that that's not true. That's not what I'm saying. On the other side, I think there's a kind of strain of wishful thinking in the Jewish community today. As we were saying about the Confederate or Southern Seder, that Jews would not be involved in the traffic in human beings because of our own history of oppression and persecution. And unfortunately, that's simply not the case. The earliest instances that we find of Jewish slave traders in the Atlantic world in the 17th and 18th centuries are actually themselves exiles from the Spanish Inquisition who had to flee for their lives, and because of that found themselves in certain places in the Atlantic world that put them in a position to participate in this traffic. So there's just no truth to this idea that because Jews had themselves experienced trauma and oppression, they were not going to participate in the oppression of others. So I'm trying to chart a true middle path here between these two opposing misconceptions. And I feel very good about the way that I did it. What I say in the book is that even if they're responsible for what one I think good estimate says about 2% perhaps of slaving voyages, slave ships while the slave trade was legal, that still amounts to tens of thousands of individuals who were trafficked on Jewish-owned ships and by Jewish factors and agents in the Caribbean, and to a lesser extent, but a real extent, in the United States, the future United States. And I'm interested in those
Didn't
stories.
keep kosher, did they?
The Jewish slave traders? They did.
Did they?
They did, yeah. Aaron Lopez, the biggest one of all in
All
Newport,
right.
Rhode Island, in the late 18th century, he kept kosher, absolutely. It didn't keep him from trading in pork, and in enslaved people. But again, there's very little kind of wrestling with this moral dilemma. It's we who see the dilemma, and who have to do the wrestling with it.
There was a sentence that you wrote that kind of popped out at me, and I'm going to read it. It may be that Civil War did as much to differentiate Jews from their fellow Americans as it did to integrate them into the larger population. Expound on that one, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so this gets at the kind of historiographical questions that I was just alluding to about how to interpret what percentage of Jews, fought in the armies. In contrast to a kind of anti-Semitic view that began with the war and then continued afterwards, which suggested that Jews really were more interested in profiting off the war than participating in it. There's been a kind of organized communal effort to insert a more triumphalist version of American Jewish history, particularly related to the Civil War. And that tradition emphasizes the anti-slavery attitudes of many Jews when, in fact, as I show in the book, there were, but they were by no means representative of the larger community, which mostly, like all people everywhere, just wanted to survive and get by. And other such like I think the August Bondy misquotation that I mentioned earlier, no more pharaohs and no more slaves, is one indication of the kind of wishful thinking that has been applied to the Civil War. And another form that wishful thinking has taken is that the Civil War was a Americanizing influence, experience for Jews and for Jewish people. They fought with their Christian comrades, and in all these battles, they died for the country, and it led to a certain kind of welcomingness. Now, when you actually look at what happened to the American Jewish community, certainly in the war, but in the period after the war, in the Gilded Age, and in the period running up to this, 1880 wave of Eastern European immigration, you see that they're actually in a very vulnerable position. They've been kind of marked out as different, right? Now, I said before the war, race matters more than religion. That's still true after the war, but it's been a little problematized. It's been complicated by the abolition of slavery and by everybody's traumatic experience of those 4 years. And so there's all these things that happen after the Civil War, which are often told as a separate story from the war itself, but I think are really related to it. So in 1866 or 1867, a bunch of insurance companies in New York decide that they're going to stop insuring Jews, Jewish-owned businesses, Jewish homes, because they're accusing Jews of starting fires and, real anti-Semitic tropes. And the Jewish community has to kind of rally to fight back against this. Similarly, later on in 1877, one of the great Jewish businessmen, Joseph Seligman, who made his fortune during the war selling Union bonds, is banned, is prohibited from entering a Saratoga hotel, this kind of landmark experience of anti-Semitism. And there's several other instances of the like, Jews banned from Coney Island, which opened in 1879. And I really think this is coming out of the war, and there's a sense of vulnerability in the American Jewish community afterwards. Now, that's when they start building these communal national organizations that they had long dreamed of before the Civil War. So boards of synagogues, colleges, and all of that. And that's sometimes been seen as evidence of communal strength, but I think it's actually a circling of the wagons and a saying we need to create our own institutions because we might not actually ever be welcomed here as equal citizens.
Did I read this wrong with Seligman? When I was trying to read about him in your book, I thought of Soros. Was he the Soros of the day to some extent?
Perhaps there were a couple, though. There was August Belmont before him, who was the
Oh,
chair
yeah.
of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Might be an equally apt comparison, and he has, a very interesting political journey, opposing Lincoln, then supporting him, then opposing him again. There are a few others, but yes, that's a lot of this stuff. The faces and the names change, but the structures of thought, are consistent.
When Maurice Mayer came into the view, I thought of this wonderful broadside that we have, an abolition trader, really talking about a Southerner who was not unhappy about slavery going away because then labor would be cheap. It would be so cheap, maybe not cost them anything. And at the bottom, you see a Democratic working man. This came out after the draft riots in New York. What was the relationship of labor and Jews?
Sure. Well, I mean, most Jews, when they arrived in the United States, were not taking the kind of manual labor jobs that Irishmen were, for instance, right? So Jews were not really involved in these working class movements right away. They were, for the most part, hitting the road as peddlers, trying to sell goods from their backpacks, from their wagons, and when they could, when they were lucky, setting up shop in, a kind of ragtag frontier town like your own Chicago, if they were lucky, and trying to build something from there. So the Jewish kind of labor story doesn't really begin until later on with the kind of sweatshops of the Lower East Side, and they're not necessarily part of the labor movement of the 1850s and the 1860s. You mentioned Maurice Mayer. He's a pretty interesting character. I don't know if you want me to go into him a little bit. He's one that scrambles those
Briefly, please.
Sure, those the political and religious spectrum. So he's another 1848er. He participated in the revolution. He was imprisoned and then he escaped. But he's also a radical reform rabbi. So he's associated with David Einhorn, one of my characters, who denounces slavery and is run out of town in Baltimore. So he's on the religious left, but he's on the political right. And I'm interested in those kinds of situations.
I wanted to get Lincoln into this a little bit, and through one of the Jews he knew fairly well, and that is his podiatrist, and that is Issachar Zachary. And I happen to have an interesting letter of his in our stock right now, in which he's in New Orleans, and no, that's Max Lazarus, but here is a letter of Zachary in May of 1863. On the he's a sensitive time. So here we are. There's he signs himself sincerely the doctor, but the person that he wrote to, whoever it is, it's not said here, blew his cover and said that's who it was from when he put it on the back so he could file it. And of course, he was a confidant of Lincoln as well. In this letter, though, he talks about E. Solomons, who he knows as a Jew in the Confederacy. And when Lincoln sent him out to New Orleans into the South, perhaps as a spy in a way of what's going on, but also to advocate for some sort of a peace, perhaps. In this letter, he says, E. Solomons, who you have heard me mention as a man of mind and influence in the Confederacy, I have bought over. So here he is trying to influence the Confederacy, the Confederate people, through the people that he knows. What was Lincoln's thought, if we had that? We know about the blacks, certainly, and even to some extent about Native Americans, but what about Jews besides Issachar? And what was their relationship? How does Issachar fit into this story with Lincoln?
Yeah, sure. Lot to get to there. Well,
I
first of all,
know.
Lincoln and the Jews, he had a lot of Jewish friends, and Jonathan Sarna wrote a wonderful book, emphasizing this, that Lincoln had lots of Jewish friends in Chicago. Abraham Jonas, one of the first Jews in Cincinnati, Ohio, and later served in the Illinois legislature alongside Lincoln, was a lifelong friend, very close friend. Several Jews I mentioned supported Lincoln and served as delegates at the 1860 convention. And then there's this interesting fellow named Issachar Zachary, who comes from London, from England, with a kind of fake medical degree that he got through basically copying somebody else's book and putting his own name on it. A very kind of shifty, shadowy figure. He's very interesting to read about and spend time with. He's said to have smelled like the winds of Araby. He had slicked back hair and wore perfume and beautiful kind of jewelry. And he treated the feet, the bunions, and whatnot of many powerful men in Washington. He finally got enough letters of recommendation to make his way to the White House, where he not only treated Lincoln's feet, but actually spent a lot of time with him. They became close friends. Even after hours, they would kind of hang together at night. And eventually, Zachary proposed, and Lincoln accepted the idea of him going to New Orleans, occupied New Orleans, under the Union Army, to kind of try to make inroads with the local Jewish population. Right. Part of Zachary's mission at this point was to reach out. You mentioned Solomon's there, to reach out to the Jewish population in New Orleans, which was really kind of suffering under the heavy-handed occupation of General Benjamin Butler and then eventually Nathaniel Banks, who Zachary was working under. That's a fascinating document for you to own, and is direct evidence of what one of his missions which was in fact to get local Jews onto his side, some of whom actually he hired, and I imagine Solomon's is one of them, he hired as secret agents in order to go out into the countryside and gather information for the Union Army about Confederate field positions and cotton plantations and all of that. And then later he actually tried to wrap up the entire war by meeting with Judah Benjamin in Richmond during the war in this really kind of far-fetched, dreamlike plan to end the war, and that failed, obviously. But he's a
Yeah.
pretty fascinating figure to spend time with.
Jews were in the arts, and here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop with Lincoln, we know of two of them especially. Samuel Alschuler, who was here in Chicago. I knew his great granddaughter
Oh
up in
wow!
Highland Park. I used to play tennis on her private tennis court and used to go there with my mother. Rose Alschuler was her name. This is the first photograph of Lincoln. Really, German is the one we see most often in Springfield with more of a beard. But here are the sproutings of his first whiskers. And Al Schuler caught that. This is the second time that Lincoln sat for him, by the way, because he had done that again earlier on in 1858. And the other is Max Rosenthal, who later had this gorgeous lithograph that he produced after the Hessler, another Chicagoan, Hessler photograph that he produced. This is a very large image that he signed. We have signed copies when those come through usually. And so there were two people from the arts that were affected by Lincoln and had something to say. Were there many more in the arts that you can tell us about quickly?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I mean, two come to mind that are really quite different. One, are you familiar with the composer Louis Moreau Gottschalk?
Yes, of
Who
course.
was half Jewish from New Orleans. His father was Jewish, I believe. His mother was a Creole, French Creole, and his father was actually a slave trader, not a big time, but he moved merchandise, including enslaved people. So Gottschalk is actually kind of the soundtrack for my book, I would say. And I actually started a podcast a few months ago, and I use his great air, "The Union," as the theme song for the podcast.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
So he comes to mind, and I was recently reading his memoir, Notes of a Pianist, all about his travels around the United States and Canada and the Caribbean and South America through the Civil War, which is a fascinating read. So I think he qualifies. And then the other, fast forwarding quite a bit, it would be Victor David Brenner, the engraver of the Lincoln penny. There's a footnote about this in the book, when I mentioned that Judah Benjamin is the only Jewish face to appear on American currency, if you count the Confederate $2 bill as currency, I have a little footnote there saying, well, Victor David Brenner is also to some extent on our currency if you have the right pennies. So those are two that come to mind. Max Rosenthal was a really fascinating find for me. I have in the book not the Lincoln image that you showed, but a lithograph that he did during the war called "The Soldier's Dream of Home," which
Oh,
is just
yes.
a
Oh,
beautiful color image of a soldier kind of reclining and thinking of
right.
his family. Um,
And there was another one he did of the wife thinking of the soldier out in the field.
oh, interesting. It'd be cool to get those side by
Yeah,
side.
there were two of them together.
Okay. Well, that lithograph and that pairing, I suppose, reminds me of one of my favorite minor characters in the book, which is Marcus Spiegel, who's
Hmm.
a colonel from Ohio who joins the Union Army mostly to kind of get out from his debts, because if you join the army, you were absolved from your debts for the period of your service. And he's really he's not pro-slavery, but he's anti-slavery. And he's against the Emancipation Proclamation. He's got some fairly racist notions about black people, but the war changes him, and he eventually avows his abolitionism in a letter to his wife, and he's killed in action. But he's a really interesting story about how the war changed people.
Hmm. Um, there's an assemblage of four names that I thought maybe you can just kind of as a grouping speak to us about. We only have about 10 minutes left, but um, it's an interesting group. Mordechai Manuel Noah, Rabbi Morris Raphael, Rabbi Maurice Mayer, we spoke of. And can you speak to that assemblage of people? What was their commonality?
Sure. Mordecai Manuel Noah is really the first kind of Jewish celebrity in the United States. He briefly serves as a consul under the Madison administration before he's fired, ostensibly because he was a Jew. And he was kind of the first person to appoint himself spokesman for Jewish Americans. He had this, kind of cockamamie notion of resettling world Jewry on Grand Island in the Niagara River. It didn't really go anywhere. But he's participating in political debates. He's a newspaper publisher in New York, and he's originally anti-slavery early in his career, but that really starts to change in the 1820s, mostly having to do with his kind of political leanings changing. And towards the end of his life, he dies in about 1850 or so. He's fairly pro-slavery, and he's taking very aggressive positions in that regard. And even inspires the founding of the first Black American newspaper, basically to kind of counter Noah's venom. Morris Jacob Raffal, who you mentioned, who's one of my 6 characters, delivers the eulogy at Mordecai Emanuel Noah's funeral, so perhaps that's a good connection, and kind of takes on the mantle to some extent of spokesperson for American Jews. Even though, whereas Noah was a fairly secular figure, Raffal is an Orthodox rabbi who comes from Birmingham, England, originally Sweden, actually. And the book begins with this sermon that he delivers in 1861, saying that the Bible, as a rabbi, he can say that the Bible endorses slavery. And that starts this whole controversy that everybody kind of needs to comment on. And that really starts the whole book. So Noah and Raffal, I think, have quite a lot in common as self-appointed spokespeople for American Jews, and also in their pro-slavery position. Morris Mayer was the rabbi at Beth Elohim in Charleston, who was also pro-slavery, but unlike Raffal, was not Orthodox. He was a Reform rabbi. And there were some Reform rabbis who endorsed slavery, and there were a few Orthodox rabbis who condemned it.
I purposely didn't really get into Judah Benjamin because he's so well known in Civil War studies. But you showed just something, you saw that we were prepared for his image on the currency. The only Jews you say to appear an American, if we call that American, it's American currency. And he rose to prominence because of his closeness with both Varina and Jefferson Davis. I also think that he became an attorney general for the Confederacy, even though his talents were wasted there. And also then Secretary of War, even though he had no background and clashed with most of the generals like Stonewall, and then became Secretary of State, where he kind of rose to a competency, I guess I would say. But he was noticeably absent. Oh, I should say also that with Lincoln, he, like Lincoln, felt that only war was going to end slavery. Lincoln, that's what he felt in a very private letter in 1856 that has not recently been given a little more shrift, but I think both of them felt the same way. It was so entrenched, only war was going to get it out. But you also say that he was conspicuously absent from the Lost Cause pantheon. You alluded to maybe why. Tell us why.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Benjamin is a fascinating character. And I know we can't get into him completely, but, I was just in New Orleans to deliver a book talk at a place called the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. And I went to the Confederate Museum there, which is one of really 2 in the country that's all devoted to Confederate relics, everybody's hair, everybody's button and whatnot. Not a thing about Judah Benjamin, the $2 bill, but that's really it. They really, just as I said, the American Jewish community has never really known what to do with Ernestine Rose, and they've had their problems with Judah Benjamin as well. The, Confederate nostalgists have never really known what to do with Judah Benjamin because he's outside their preferred view of a Southern Christian nationalism. Benjamin, was misplaced as Attorney General and as Secretary of War. But at 2 moments during the war, I think he really knew exactly what was going on, and the Confederacy missed out by not kind of taking advantage of his insights. As you say, he knew that there would be a war. Everybody else in the South said, oh, the Yankees will never fight, and if they do, it'll be a short war. Benjamin knew that there would be a war and that it would be a big one. And so he said, let's get out ahead of it. Let's get out ahead of the coming Union blockade. Let's send a whole bunch of cotton to England to draw on as loans, right, for much needed funds that we're going to need. And they said, no, there's not going to be a war. There's no need to do that. You're overreacting. And of course, he was right. And at the very end of the war, Benjamin, really alone among the top Confederate officials, said we should emancipate military age enslaved people, in exchange for their service in the army. And he started proposing that to Davis, who was intrigued but knew that politically it was toxic. And of course, the Confederacy did not do that until it was too late. I think in both those instances, he showed not only a brilliance, which everybody kind of remarked about him, but also this ability to kind of stand outside the Confederate romanticization of what they were doing, the self-mythologizing. And, I think we can overstate it. But I think something of that must have had to do with his own outsiderness from Southern society as a Jew and as an immigrant.
Maybe one, I've always thought, I got to admit, that one of the reasons that he rose to prominence in the government was that they all knew he was Jewish and therefore would not be against them for the presidency. He couldn't get to the top. So let him do what he wants to do. He can't be our boss ever. One other commonality with Lincoln. Lincoln once here in Illinois had to jump out of the legislative chamber window to get away from a political vote. Benjamin had to jump out of a window to get away from a gambling den. I kind of like that juxtaposition.
Right.
Let me ask you this. I've found that books on ethnic peoples, whether it's a book on the Irish, a book on the Germans, or a book on religion, Christianity in the Civil War or whatever, are mainly read by those ethnicities or religious groupings. And it could be might be the same thing, that the Jewish community will embrace this and read about ourselves, but might not be read widely. Why should non-Jews perhaps read this? What are they going to learn from this that would be a good read for them?
Great question. I very much hope that they will. I think 3-4 months out from publication, it's too soon to say. But why should they? I mean, I think it gives a kind of an angle on the Civil War experience as an American experience that we're not otherwise familiar with. And it highlights, there's a section in the book towards the end where I say that the Civil War was a Jewish experience and not only for the Jews, right? Again, I go through, the Southerners often saw themselves as a kind of persecuted Hebrew people by the Egyptian Pharaoh known as Lincoln, right? And they used all this language. Whereas the Northerners, New Englanders also saw themselves ever since Puritan times as the modern day, equivalents of the ancient Hebrews. And of course, as I mentioned before, enslaved Black people did too. So for everybody, the Civil War was in some sense a kind of Old Testament experience because it was so bloody, it was so drawn out, and it was so obviously circling around basic kind of issues of morality and statecraft and peoplehood and nations that put everybody in mind of the Old Testament and of the Jewish story. So I think that we can't really understand the Civil War in that respect without understanding this Jewish angle to it. There's also, it highlights the experience of the 1848ers who were not only Jewish, people who had participated in those European revolutions, who brought their ideals to America, and all kinds of other little sidelights to the Civil War episode and experience, and its kind of legacy in the late 19th century, the 20th, and even today, that I think we don't really appreciate if we don't see this really rich story.
Well, it's a fascinating book, and I recommend this widely because it's an area that's really has not been really investigated as you have, especially with the slavery angle, which is so fraught with so many things that we've already talked about for an hour. So here is the book, Fear No Pharaoh, American Jews, the Civil War, and the Fight to End Slavery. And I think you would enjoy this book, and you will get first editions and this wonderful book plate that you can put in as well that will act as a signed book for you.